Good day, learners. I welcome you all to the discussion on social sciences history as we prepare for the end of year examinations. We are going to do a discussion on history as part of the social science subject, and we are going to focus on key areas which are examinable. We have a sample paper that we're going to use that we're going to guide us through the discussion. We're going to use a set of questions and use some explanations to those set of questions as a way of trying to guide and prepare the learners as they prepare for the final examination. So we are going to go through our paper and try to elaborate and discuss on some key aspects of the given set of questions. Right, without wasting much time, let's go to our questions. Right. Our first part is mainly based on multiple choice questions, and we are going just to try to highlight the correct responses and also try to give explanations as to why some of those responses are deemed to be the correct responses, giving some explanations and some descriptions to the given set of responses and the given set of questions. Right, the first part, question number 1.1, it says, what was the main aim of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights? What was the main aim of the UDHR, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights? We understand that after the Second World War, countries across the globe, they agreed on upholding humanity and dignity through the countries adopting and signing the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which was a document that highlighted fundamental human rights, which were enshrined, which were supposed to be respected to uphold humanity and dignity of all the people after seeing the negative implication that was brought by the Second World War. So if our question is saying what was the aim of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, our response there, which is correct, is response C, which says to set universal standards. Universal standards, we are saying those standards were supposed to be applicable to each and every living human being across the whole world on how human beings should behave towards one another and respect everybody's dignity. That was the main aim of the UDHR. Right, moving on to the next question. Define the word racism. What is racism? Right. Racism is described as B. It is discrimination or unfair treatment based on a person's race. Remember, we must understand the idea of racism and the types of racism as, for example, we have typical ideas of racism. It is basically the belief that some people are better than others. There are some specific groups of people who are better than others. That's the idea of racism. And therefore, it justifies the idea of discriminating other people based on their race. We have aspects like historical racism. We have aspects like the new racism. Those are typical examples of how racism is enshrined. We have typical examples of scientific racism. Those are typical ways through which the idea of race is enshrined, where people have that belief that some specific groups of people are deemed to be better compared to others. And hence, therefore, it is justified to implement some discriminatory tendencies on such people who are deemed to be inferior according to their outlook or their appearances. But however, what you must note at the end of the day is, according to the findings of the Human Genome Project, we all originated from the same ancestors who were Africans for that matter. So there's not, it's just a myth. Right, moving on to the next question. Right, source A, extract from a speech delivered by J.G. Strijom, Prime Minister from 1954 to 1958. It is only through a policy of white bascap or supremacy that peaceful coexistence between whites is possible. That's the speech. Right. Which part came into power in 1948? The power which came into power in 1948 is the National Party. Right, brief background of South African history from 1910, after the Anglo-Boer War, not after, rather. From 1910, there was formation of the Union of South Africa, which was a union of both the British and the Boers working together in a combined government. They formed the Union of South Africa in 1910. But however, as time went by, the union was dissolved in 1948 after elections. And after these elections, it was when the National Party came into power. And the National Party, when it came into power, that is when it legalized apartheid. So we are saying before this time of before the time of 1948, before this 1948 era, it was an era of segregation. Segregation, remember, we define it as forced separation of people in their daily lives. The government of the Union of South Africa was trying to forcibly separate Black people from the white people, but they did not legalize it. But after the National Party, which was a Boer government, came into power in 1948, they entrenched segregation, which means they made segregation further advanced. They legalized it into apartheid. So it's the National Party which came into power in 1948. Then what is apartheid? When we are defining apartheid, remember, it must refer to South Africa because it was specifically a policy in South Africa. So it is a policy of the National Party. Remember, we are saying the National Party is the one that came into power in 1948 and entrenched the segregation which had existed from 1910. So in this instance, we are saying it is a policy of the National Party that separated people according to their race. That was apartheid. It's a discriminatory policy that forcibly separated people according to their race, which was instituted by the National Party in South Africa from 1948 until 1993 rather. Right. Then moving on the next part, it says, which apartheid law controlled people's access to places and amenities? Which apartheid law controlled people's access to places and amenities? Right, that is the Separate Amenities Act of 1953. Amenities were segregated, meaning to say all facilities. For example, we can talk of train sections. We can talk of amenities like the parks, amenities like libraries, amenities like the beaches, amenities like toilets. They were all segregated, meaning to say through the separate amenities, white people were supposed to use their own amenities. If it was a train, the trains were labeled that Europeans only and other races, which means that no person from other races was supposed to use the section of the train for Europeans. It was specifically for whites. The libraries, there were spaces for the whites and spaces for Africans or other races. The beaches, the toilets, all facilities that you can think of because of that. So it limited the people's access to amenities because of that legislation of the Separate Amenities Act of 1953. Right, which law prohibited intermarriages between different races? It's the Prohibition of Mixed Marriages Act. Intermarriages were not allowed. They did not allow for intermarriages, meaning to say a person from one race could not marry a person from another race. Like an African person would not marry a white person. An African man could not marry a white woman. It was against the law which was stipulated under the Prohibition of Mixed Marriages Act of 1949. Right, let's go to source B. We are going to employ the following weapons: immediate and active boycott, strike, civil disobedience, non-cooperation, making of plans for a national stoppage of work for 1 day as a mark of protesting policy of the government. That's a statement. Then the question says, what was the role played by SACP? The SACP, we are looking at the South African, is the South African Communist Party. What was its role? If we check the role of the South African National Communist Party, it was to organize workers around issues of trade unions and the right of the national liberation demands. That was the role of the SACP, to organize workers around issues of trade unions, rights, and also national liberation demands. Why was the SACP banned? Why did the government ban the Communist Party? Right, the correct response is B. For the government feared the spread of communism. If I can take you back to the first term, remember there was that idea of capitalism versus communism as economic ideologies or as political ideologies. We had capitalism and communism. Right, the idea of capitalism is that of private ownership. They believe that resources must be privately owned. Individuals must take initiative to use resources for their own benefit. But in communism, they believe in collective ownership. So, which means the idea of communists were against apartheid, because apartheid was segregatory, meaning to say that it was giving favors to the white people, which is a discriminatory policy, which is part of the capitalistic ideology, that white people must own resources, they must own the large chunk of the South African land, they must be able to run businesses and disallow black people to operate businesses. And the black person must work for the white person. Those are capitalistic ideologies. But communist ideologies were differing to those ideas of capitalism, and they were differing to the ideas of apartheid. They were opposing or challenging the ideas of apartheid. They were advocating for equality, which was against apartheid. Every person must be respected and treated with dignity despite their race. Whether you are black, white, orange, or red, you must be treated the same. So apartheid government did not want those ideas to be imposed into South Africa or to be accepted as part of the South African society. So they were fearing for the spread of communism. So that is why they had to ban the Communist Party, because they were advocating for ideas that were against the principles of apartheid. Right. Moving on to the next question. The question is saying, which three weapons, according to source B, did the program of action call for? Which three weapons, according to the source B, did the program of action called for? Right, if you are to check the source, what did it call for? That is the weapons that were called for. We are, with immediate effect and active boycott, we are calling for civil disobedience. They were also calling for non-cooperation. They're also calling for strikes. They're also calling for active boycotts. Those are the weapons that they were supposed to use. Active boycotts, they were refusing to participate, striking, and doing civil disobedience and non-cooperation. So we have to look at the response which is relevant there. The most relevant response there is civil disobedience, strikes, and boycotts. Why is this one wrong? It's because there's voting here, is out, there's negotiation is out, and also campaigns, they are out. So the correct response is A. Why was Albert Luthuli awarded a Nobel Prize, Peace Prize? Chief Albert Luthuli, why was he awarded the Nobel Peace Prize? His ideas in the challenge against apartheid, remember, Albert Lutuli was a chief, and he was advocating for non-violent protests. He was advocating for the people of South Africa to use non-violent means against the government. That is why he was awarded with the Nobel Prize, because whatever he was doing in the challenge against apartheid, he was advocating for people not to use force or not to use confrontational means or not to use violent means, but rather resort to peaceful ways of protest. So our correct response is for his role in the non-violent struggle against apartheid. His role in the non-violent struggle against apartheid. Right. What was the defiance campaign? Right. Briefly describing the defiance. When you are defying, looking at the defiance campaign, you are refusing to follow orders. You are defying, you refuse to follow the order. You are given orders, you are given laws, then you voluntarily break those laws, knowing that you are going against the law. You refuse to obey the laws that are set, that you must obey. We know that there are a set of rules and regulations that are supposed to be followed by every person in a given country. But if you voluntarily break those laws, you know that you must not do something and you do it deliberately. That is a defiant act. So the defiance campaign, we are saying it was a program of deliberately breaking the apartheid laws. People deliberately broke the apartheid laws knowingly. For example, the pass laws. They knew well that people were supposed to be carrying the passes. It was which required all African men in cities and towns to be in possession of their passes wherever they were going. But people left their passes deliberately at home. It was a defiant way. Or, for example, against the separate amenities. People will go and use facilities for the whites. They will go and use the beach sections for the whites. They will go and use toilet facilities for the whites. They will go into train sections for the whites. Why were they doing that? They did that deliberately so that they would get arrested and fill up the prisons. That was going to weaken the government. Because remember, taking care of the prisoners is a burden on the government. And once the prisons are full, where were they going to put further people who were arrested for breaking the apartheid laws? It was going to weaken the system. That was the defiance campaign. Right, number 12. What was the objective of the defiance campaign? We have slightly highlighted on the objective of the defiance campaign. It hoped that many people would be arrested, that the jails would be full, and the government would change the laws. That was the main objective of the defiance campaign. Then we move on to number 13. It is called for, it said, why was the Freedom Charter important? Why was the Freedom Charter important? Right. When we're talking of the Freedom Charter, we are looking at the document which was adopted in Cape Town, which became a basis of the challenge against apartheid. They drew a document which highlighted the demands that the people of South Africa were making against the apartheid government towards equality, towards fairness. So it was highlighting the principles that were the demands of the people of South Africa against the apartheid government, which were supposed to be followed to attain equality in the South African society. So the Freedom Charter was important. The response, which is correct, is it called for a non-racial South Africa where all people would be treated equally. Non-racial in the sense that there was supposed to be a disregard on the differences of the people's races. Every person was supposed to be treated equally despite their racial group. Right. Moving on to number 14. It says, what was the reaction of the people towards the Freedom Charter? Towards the Freedom Charter, how did people react? Right. The correct response there is not everybody agreed with the terms of the Freedom Charter. Mainly the whites, they did not agree with the terms of the Freedom Charter. because they did not want a non-racial South Africa from the system of apartheid, and hence they did not want to benefit equally. They did not want to be treated the same as other races. They wanted to benefit from the system alone and disadvantage other races. Right, so number 1.15, the question says, why were 156 people arrested in 1956 and charged with high treason? Why were 156 people arrested in 1956 and charged with high treason? Right, what happened there is they were accused of using violence to overthrow the government and replace it with a communist state. Treason, basically, this is a crime of betrayal of your own government, betrayal of own country. So if you are charged with treason, it's a very high-rated crime. If you are, for example, you are charged with treason, for example, you want to overthrow the government, you are betraying your own country. So those people were accused of using violence to overthrow the government, and they wanted to replace it with a communist state. Remember, communism was one of the worst enemies of apartheid. What is the connection between treason trial and the Freedom Charter? How were the two connected? The treason trial and the Freedom Charter, those two had a connection. Right, the connection is on response C. The people charged with high treason were in favor of the Freedom Charter. People who were charged for overthrowing the government, they were advocating for equality. They were preaching the gospel of equality. They did not want a racial South Africa. They were advocating for a non-racial South Africa. That's the connection there. Right, number 17. What was the reason for the Women's March of 1956? We see the prominent figures like Helen Joseph, the likes of Lillian Ngoyi. Why were they marching to the Union Building in 1956? What was the reason for the Women's March? Right, the correct response there is A. They wanted to deliver a petition against carrying of passes by women. Remember, the passes initially, they were meant for the men. African men in cities and towns were supposed to be carrying a pass as a legal document to allow them to stay in a city or in a town. But later on, the law was now being extended to women. African women were also supposed to carry passes, and that prompted the women to do a petition and to march to the union buildings to show their discontent towards women also being included as part of people to be required to be in possession of the passes whenever they were in a city or in a town. So ultimately, that was the reason for the Women's March of 1956. Right, going on to the next question, which is number 18, 1.18. Who were the leaders of the Women's March? I think I've slightly highlighted on some of those. The prominent leaders, we have Raima Musa, we had Lillian Ngoyi, we had Helen Joseph, and also we have Sophia William. Those were the prominent leaders of the Women's March. Right. In which year was the PAC formed? The Pan-African Congress. The PAC was the Pan-African Congress. It was a black political movement which became a political party. The PAC was formed in 1960. Right. Why was the PAC formed? What was the rationale? What was the rationale for the forming of the PAC? The PAC, they believed that South Africa must be liberated by Black Africans. Their belief was that they had to engage themselves in a struggle to liberate the African society, the South African society. They were supposed to be a movement which was supposed to bring in a revolution in South Africa to liberate the general South Africans from suppression by the apartheid rule. Right. Let's look at source C. Source C is talking about the Soweto uprising. We are seeing the crowd of students who are protesting against Africans. We do not want Africans. To hell with Africans. Those are some of the texts written on those placards, on those billboards that the kids are carrying. Right. What was the Soweto uprising of 1976? What was it? We understand the Soweto uprising, it was ultimately a demonstration by students in Soweto schools, by students of Soweto schools against the enactment of statutory instrument 5050, which advocated for the use of Afrikaans as a medium of instruction. We are saying Afrikaans was proposed to be a language of learning and teaching in schools for some given subjects. And that prompted the learners to organize themselves and pose a challenge to the apartheid government through demonstrations. They did not want to learn in Afrikaans. Right. So, checking on our responses, our response for question number 21, it was a series of demonstrations. It was a series of demonstrations by students of Soweto against the use of Afrikaans as a medium of instruction. That was the idea. That was the Soweto uprising of the 16th of June in 1976. Right, question 22, 1.22, it says, what is the law that resulted in the Soweto uprising? We understand we are talking about school students here. The law that was aligned towards education was the Bantu Education Act of 1953. Number 123, 1.23. What was the main leader? Who was the main leader of the Soweto uprising? The main leader we understand was Mashinini. Sisi Mashinini was the main leader of the Soweto uprising. Right, then there's a picture taken on 16 June 1976 of the unfortunate shooting of innocent students. And we are seeing that picture as a popular picture of the student who was shot in that demonstration. Right. And we understand that it's Hector Peterson, which is a popular portrayal of the Soweto uprising, even up to now. Whenever I talk of the Soweto uprising, remember, that's the prominent picture that is used to show how ruthless the apartheid government was. Who was the student carried in the picture? The student was Hector Peterson. Who carried the student who had been shot? We are looking at the one who is carrying here. Who was the person who was carrying? That was Mbuyisa Makubo. There was Mbuyisa Makubo. Right. What was the reaction of the South African police towards the protests? How did the police react to the protests? Right. The police started shooting at the students. That is why it ended up being a fatal demonstration, because the police used brutal means to disperse the demonstrating students by shooting at them. So the police started shooting at the students. Then number 27, how did students react after learning that the student who had been shot had died? The student who was shot had died. How did they respond? They did not cease the fight. They burned buildings belonging to the state and destroyed police houses. That was their action. Right. Number 28. What action was imposed by the apartheid government that triggered the Soweto uprising? What action was imposed by the government? I think we discussed that. The trigger of the Soweto uprising was the use of Afrikaans to teach mathematics and social studies. Use of Afrikaans to teach mathematics and social studies. What was the role played by the media in exposing the 1976 event? The media, what did it do to expose the ruthless part of the apartheid government? The media helped in exposing the real picture of what was happening in South Africa. Remember, the government was claiming that there was no crisis in South Africa. Whenever they were on international platforms, they would say that there was no crisis in South Africa. But because of the media, the journalists were able to capture the event, and it was able to reach all parts across the world, which led to the apartheid government being criticized on the international platform. But however, before that, the government was claiming that there was no problem in South Africa. There was no crisis. As they portrayed the image of South Africa positively on the international community, they would claim that there was no problem in South Africa. There was no crisis. But however, because of the media was able to expose the reality of what was happening on ground in South Africa. They were able to expose the reality of the situation in South Africa. Right, that was number 29. Move on to number 30. How did the international community respond to media reports on the uprising? How did the international community, we are looking at now other countries across the world, how did they respond? Right, the response there, how did they respond? Is response number B. They imposed economic and cultural sanctions against South Africa. South Africa was sanctioned, which meant that countries were no longer willing to trade with South Africa because of what it had done to its very own people, because of the brutality of the apartheid government, because of its disregard of humanity and human rights. It was sanctioned by other countries. Right, number 1.31, it says, what is the meaning of sanctions? What are sanctions? Sanctions is defined by B. It is a practice of not trading with a country that has an unjust system of government. We refuse to trade with you. Remember, no country can sustain on its own or in isolation. You need to sell your products to other countries to get currencies of other countries so that you can also buy some products that you don't have from other countries. But if countries refuse to trade with you, it means you will now be isolated and your economy won't be viable because there are some essentials that you need to get from other countries that you might not be able to produce by your own self. So South Africa was sanctioned, which means it was put into isolation because of its bad governance, because of its policy of apartheid. It was put into isolation by other countries. It was sanctioned. Right, we move on to number 1.32. What type of sanctions were imposed on South Africa by the international community? We are looking at the type of sanctions. Right, South Africa was banned from participating in international and cultural trading activities. It was banned from participating. Right, explain the impact of sanctions on the economy, on South African economy. How did it affect the economy of South Africa, like what we have been discussing? It impacted as foreign investments dropped and countries refused to trade with South Africa. Foreign investments, people bringing in investments into South Africa, bringing in money to do business, they reduced. And also other countries refusing to partake trade with South Africa. Right, taking it to the next question. The next question is saying, use source E, extract from a speech given by Reverend Alan Bozak, the leader of the United Democratic Front, the UDF. Let me remind you of three little words. The first word is all. We want all our rights, and we want all of South Africa's people to have their rights. The second word is here. We want all our rights here in a united and divided South Africa. We do not want them in impoverished homelands. We do not want them in our separate little group areas. The third is now. We want all our rights, We want all our rights. We want them here, and we want them now. That's the speech by Reverend Alan Bozak, who was the leader of the United Democratic Front. What does the UDF stands for? I think I've mentioned it as I was going through. The UDF means the United Democratic Front. What strategy was followed by the Mass Democratic Movement? The MDM, what strategy did they follow? Right, the MDM was formed after the banning of the UDF. It also had the same principles as the UDF. It was fostering civil disobedience. It was advocating for people to disobey unjust laws, to disobey the laws of apartheid, which were unfair to the African community. They were supposed to defy and disrespect and non-comply to those apartheid regulations. Right. Number 1.36, it says, what role was played by the UDF in the struggle for liberation? What role was played by the UDF? The UDF played a big role in opposition of the tricameral parliament. It organized communities to oppose the tricameral parliament. The main was the Don't Vote campaign. The Don't Vote campaign by the UDF, where they were advocating for the colored people not to vote in the trilateral parliamentary elections, which was a cosmetic parliament which was meant to absorb other races and want it to appear as if it was a non-racial parliament, which encompassed the coloreds and the Indians. So the UDF was advocating that those groups which were added to the parliament, who were included in the cosmetic parliament, the coloreds and the Indians, were not supposed to participate in such elections of a parliament. That was the Don't Vote campaign by the UDF. Right. Who formed the Mass Democratic Movement? The MDM. Who formed the MDM? It was formed by the UDF and the COSATU, Confederation of South African Trade Unions. Those were the two arms. After the UDF was banned, it later on led to the formation of the MDM and also the labor union, the COSATU. It was also prominent in organizing the formation of the Mass Democratic Movement. Let's look at source F. Source F is saying, the collapse of the USSR in 1989 meant that the National Party could no longer use communism as a justification for their oppression. The ANC could also no longer rely on the Soviet Union for economic and military support. That's the situation. When did the Cold War end? We're looking at the end of the Cold War, the era of tensions between capitalism and communism. It ended in 1990. The Cold War tensions ended. That is where we started a new world era, the third world era, the new world order. After 1990, we're in a new world order, which was out of the era of Cold War tensions between capitalism and communism. Then number 1.39, it says, what were the frontline states? Frontline states. The frontline states is a common question, which also became a question trending on the media for some other reason. Right, the frontline states, they were a coalition of African countries from the 1960s, the 1990s, committed to end apartheid and white domination in South Africa. Right. When we're looking at these countries, we're looking at the countries, the likes of Mozambique, Zambia, Zimbabwe. We have countries like Botswana. Those countries, they were trying to assist South Africans to challenge apartheid and bring to an end the unjust rule of apartheid. So they were committed in a way. They were assisting South Africa in a way to try and bring a revolution into South Africa, which was going to weaken apartheid and ultimately bring it to non-existence. Those were what you call the front line states. Right. Then our question number 1.40, it says, Which of the following are frontline states? Which of the following are frontline states? Right, our frontline states, we have A. We're looking at these countries like Tanzania, Botswana, Zimbabwe, Zambia, and Angola. Those were the frontline states. We are looking at countries in the region, Southern African region, predominantly. Those were the ones who were actively involved in the assistance of South Africa to challenge apartheid. Right, moving on to the next question. It says, number 1.41. It says, evaluate the impact of the end of Cold War on South Africa. The end of Cold War in South Africa, the tensions between communism and capitalism, when it ended, it resulted in the unbanning of political movements and the release of Nelson Mandela and all political prisoners. They had to release Nelson Mandela and also release other people who were arrested on reasons related to politics of the day. And hence, that paved the way for the beginning of a negotiated settlement which led to a democratic South Africa. The National Party government offered to negotiate with African revolutionary movements to find a way of forming a transitional government that will lead to elections, and that was going to lead to creation of a new South Africa, which became a democratic South Africa in 1994. Right, number 1.42. Who was the president of South Africa at the time of the unbanning of political parties? The president during that time, it was President F.W. de Klerk. F.W. de Klerk. It was from P.W. Botha. Then there was a transition from P.W. Botha to F.W. de Klerk. And it was de Klerk who opted that he was going to begin a new era in South Africa. An era of violence had been brought to an end with his coming into parliament. And he promised a new era of non-violence in South Africa, and he opted for the release of Nelson Mandela unconditionally, and also the release of other political prisoners who had been imprisoned by the apartheid regime. Right, taking it to the next question, we have number 1.43. What does the term unbanning means? Unbanning. The term unban, it means to allow something or someone who was prevented. Unbanning is the opposite of banning. If you are banning someone, you are preventing someone from operating or from existing. Political parties were banned. ANC was banned. When it was banned, it means it was declared illegal. It was not supposed to operate. But when we're talking of unbanning, we are resuming its operations. We are now allowing it back to operate the normal way it was operating, or we are now allowing it to operate the way it was supposed to operate. That's unbanning. Right, then moving on to number 1.44, it says, when were the political movements unbanned? That was on the 2nd of February, 1990. 2 February 1990. Who were the leaders released from prison in 1989? Those who were released from prison in 1989, we had Walter Sisulu, we had Raymond Mhlaba, we had Andrew Mhlangen, and Ahmed Hatrada. Those were the ones who were released. Let's see. The number 46 says, how did South Africa address its political differences? How did South Africa address its political difference after 1989? It was addressed through the process of negotiation, what we call a settled negotiation. They had to settle down. The National Party government, which was the apartheid government, had to settle down with African revolutionary movements and political parties to pave way for a discussion, to set conditions of a negotiation and come to a conclusion that was going to bring back South Africa into normal functioning. So it was done through the process of a settled negotiation. Right, then moving on to number 147. When was Nelson Mandela released from prison? Nelson Mandela, when was he released from prison? That happened on the 11th of February in 1990. That was when he was unconditionally released from prison. Right. What does the term CODESA stand for? That is a Convention for a Democratic South Africa, which is C. CODESA means Convention for a Democratic South Africa. What was the role played by CODESA in the history of South Africa? What did CODESA play? It played a big role, CODESA. It was ultimately a role in making political parties, 19 of them, reach an agreement that South Africa should be non-racial and democratic country. Then number 15, why were the CODESA negotiations not as peaceful as expected? Why were those negotiations to become a non-racial country? Why were they not as peaceful as was expected? It was many people doubted that the process would be fair, while other groups started to use violence to destabilize the country. There were some other Black and African political movements that were against the process of negotiation. They did not want to be involved in a settled negotiation with the whites. They wanted to continue with the armed struggle. They wanted to continue with the fight against the apartheid government because they were optimistic that they were going to win using the armed struggle. And hence, they did not want any negotiations. So, by other political movements from the African side accepting negotiations, they wanted to destabilize the process. So that is why there was some instances of violence through the negotiation process. That is why there was disturbing violence through the process of settled negotiation. Right, then number 51. When did the first democratic elections take place? The first democratic elections, they took place on 27 April 1994. The 27th of April, that was when the first elections were held, which resulted in the first president getting into office, who was Nelson Mandela. Right, that takes us to the end of our section of multiple choice questions. Right, we also need to take a look at section B, which has got some source questions, and also we need to discuss question 2. We also need to discuss question 3, which is part of the source based questions. Then we'll conclude by looking at question number 4. Right, we're not going to waste much time. We're just going to look at the sources. This is a case of forced removals because of the Group Areas Act. Sophia Town forced removals. It's a typical case of forced removals in action. The legislation which required people to live according to groups of their races. Right. So we're not going to go through the source. We're going to go and try to resort to the questions. Right. The first question is saying, under which apartheid law? Under which apartheid law were people moved from Sophia Town? The apartheid law which was in action was the Group Areas Act. Group Areas Act. That was the law which required people to be moved and be positioned wherever they were supposed to belong according to the law. Why do you think people of Sophia Town were forcibly removed? Why were they removed? Why were they forcibly removed from that particular area? One, the reason was the area was declared white. The area was declared a white area. So it meant that the area being declared a white area, it meant that no other race was supposed to be accommodated in that particular area because it was declared an area for the whites. So the area was declared to be a white area. And also, we can also justify that they did not want mixing, to avoid mixing of races there. If an area was deemed to be a white area, then it meant that all other races were supposed to be moved according to Group Areas Act. The act required people to live in areas that were designated for them and not to live anywhere anyhow and mix with other races. And hence those people were supposed to be forcibly moved from the area. Right. Then the next question is saying, what impact did the forced removals have on the people of forced removals? What impact did forced removals have? What impact did forced removals have over the people of Sophia Town? Right. So the impact that they have here is those who resisted, they could be arrested. If you try to resist, remember the police were using force. So if you try to resist, you could be arrested for violating the law. It was one of the negative impact of that legislation there. And the other impact was that they were separated, families were separated. Some mixed families were separated for that reason. And also during the process, some people lost their belongings. Because remember, it was forceful. The police had to forcibly move the people, take their belongings into the police trucks and transport them into Midlands. So those people who tried to resist, they were arrested, and some of those people, they lost their belongings in the process because it was a violent process. It was not an organized process. People were trying to resist, but at the same time, the police were brutal against those who tried to resist, and they were forcibly removing their belongings into the trucks to transport them to the area that was supposed to be a new area for the African communities. And also for the colored communities and the Indians, they were supposed to go to their respective areas. So people also lost their belongings in the process. And also, you also have the effect of people having to stay far away from their jobs. For that reason, people who were staying in Sophia Town, the Africans had to go into Midlands. And for that reason, they had been staying away from their jobs. It was a cost on the people to stay away from their jobs because they were forcibly removed from the area that they used to stay. If they were working in Joburg, they were closer, but however, they were now coming from Soweto, which was a distance. So it was a negative implication on the lives of the people for that reason. Right, then looking at source question 3, use source H and your own knowledge. It's contradicting newspaper reports on the Sharpeville massacre. Right, we're going to look at the question. Why did the people march to Sharpeville police station on the 21st of March? Why did the people march to the police station? Right. The reason there is why they moved there. They wanted to be arrested. Why? For not carrying their passes. Or those who had their passes, they had to burn their passes before the police so that the police would arrest them, knowing well that they had no passes with them. So it was a way of showing their discontent towards the pass laws by going to the police station without passes and trying to show that we want to be arrested, we did not carry our passes, and those who had their passes, they were openly burning them to show the police that we no longer keep these documents. If you can arrest us, can you do so with immediate effect? Who was the leader of the Sharpeville massacre and which organization did he belong? Right, if we check the history of the Sharpeville massacre, they were led by a guy who was called Robert Sobukwe. And we understand Robert Sobukwe was the leader of the Pan-African Congress, which is the PAC. That was the prominent leader of the Sharpeville massacre. He was the one who led the Sharpeville march and led people to the police station and apparently declaring that they wanted to be arrested, and the police became violent on the peaceful protesters. Right. Number 3.3 says, the newspaper article gives us different points of view on the events of the Sharpeville massacre. Discuss 2 points on the view shown by source H on the events of the Sharpeville massacre. Right, the newspaper is giving us 2 views about the events of the Sharpeville massacre. What is it saying? Right, if we check, the newspaper is saying, on March 21, Pan-African leaders Sharpeville massacre assembled a demonstration of 5,000 to 7,000 people, in part through intimidating locals to join. In the morning, they led the protest to Sharpeville police station, where they demanded to be arrested for not carrying passes. Police reinforcements arrived during the incident. The March 22 New York Times reported South African Air Force planes flew over the trouble spot in a show of force, but the Africans ignored all orders to disperse. In the afternoon, small scuffles broke out and some demonstrators began throwing rocks at the police. As the crowd moved towards one scuffle, the police began firing the crowds. The April 3 New York Times published an account by Humphrey Taylor, an assistant editor at Drum magazine, who was white, who described the demonstration as peaceful and a little threat to the officers' safety. He wrote, "We heard a chatter of the machine gun, then another. Bodies were falling. Hundreds of children were running. Some of the children were shot too. Still shooting went on." That's the account. Right. So if you check the view here, which is shown by the source, it implies that the view of this newspaper here, it implies that the report, as seen on the 22nd of March, it suggests that on the 21st of March, it suggests that the planes flew over and Africans ignored all orders. So it implies that the Africans were warned. By the 22nd of March, it reported that they were warned by the planes who flew over the troubled spot to show full force, but they ignored. That's the view. So the view is they were warned. They were warned, apparently. The view of this one, it suggests that the police warned the protesters. But they ignored. And they threw stones. Then the other view, if you also check, it reports that the police started shooting. If you check the other report, it is contradictory, saying police started shooting. Without warning. So the views are contradicting. One is saying the people were given the warning, and then they even threw stones at the police. They ignored the warning and threw stones. But if you check here, this account is talking about the police shooting at the demonstrators who were peaceful and where there was no threat to the officers. They were even safe. The people were harmless. They did not intend to cause any harm, but they started shooting at the people and people started falling as we hear the machine gun one after the other. So those are the two views. Right. As a historian, what do you think was the reason for the different points of views in the same event? Why are those events portrayed differently? Why are those views portrayed differently? One is saying the people were given a warning, and the other one is saying police just shot the people. Right, if you check the first report, it is biased. It is from the point of view, this one, yeah? By saying that we want the people, this is a police point of view. They are trying to protect the police, to say that we warned the people, but they refused. But in response, the people, instead of them responding to the warning, they started throwing stones at the police. So this is different because it's a police view. Then this one here, this is a view of someone who was a witness, because they actually saw the event happening. It's a witness, which is a first hand. And this one here is a neutral. It's not biased towards any of the two, either the protesters or the police. They are giving a neutral view, which is unbiased. They are trying to shed light on what actually happened without any bias. So why those views are different is, one, because the first view that the police warned the protesters is the side of the police. They're trying to protect themselves, that they did not recklessly shoot at the people. It was the people who started throwing stones at them, and then they retaliate by shooting back at the people. But however, the other view, it says the police just shot at the people, and they were even safe. There was no risk on the side of the officers, but rather they started to use force on the people by chanting the machine gun. So it's a witness view, which is a neutral view. That is why those two are different. Right, then the last question on that one, it says, explain why the Sharpeville massacre is regarded as the turning point in South African history. When we're talking of a turning point, we are saying it's an event that brings in significant changes in the course of life of people. How did the Sharpeville massacre bring in a significant change in the political terrain of South Africa? In what way was it a significant event towards the transition of the politics of South Africa? Right. In the sense that if we check the Sharpeville march, because it was a peaceful, it had been peaceful. It had been peaceful protest. It was a peaceful protest, which turned into a military armed struggle. People are demonstrating peacefully, but however, the police responded with force, and hence it later on became an armed struggle. And the events that unfolded after the Sharpeville massacre, they brought a complete change to the political terrain. The government started instituting the state of emergency. It emerged a state of emergency after the Sharpeville massacre, and also that was when political parties were banned. So it brought significant changes in the sense that a peaceful protest ended up being an armed struggle. And after that, the government instituted more ruthless ways of repressing resistance. It instituted a state of emergency and also banned political parties. The ANC and PAC were banned. Right. Let's go to the last question, which is question 4. It's a paragraph question. Use source I and your own knowledge to answer the question that follows. An extract from a speech of the Deputy Minister of Bantu Education. No, I have not consulted the African people on the language issue, and I am not going to. An African might find that the big boss only spoke Afrikaans or only spoke English. It would be to his advantage to know both languages. Thus, the understanding of the Deputy Minister of the Bantu Education, that is understanding of him wanting to introduce Afrikaans, that is his rationale, wanting to introduce Afrikaans. Right. So in a paragraph of 8 to 10 lines, discuss the causes of the Soweto uprising. We're just going to highlight the causes of the uprising here. Right. One of the causes of the uprising is based on 1, Afrikaans medium of instruction. The government wanted to use Afrikaans as a medium of instruction, which was rejected by the students because they did not want to use the language of the oppressor to learn in schools. That was one of the causes. Then you can also look at the independence of Mozambique and Angola. How did the independence of Mozambique and Angola fueled the Soweto uprising? It led to optimism. South Africans became optimistic that if other regions if other countries in the region are getting their independence, then South Africa was also at some point in time going to get its independence. So the challenge against apartheid was motivated by the fact that other countries had been liberated. Then you can also look at the Black consciousness ideas by Steve Biko. Blacks were conscientized of the need to uphold their cultural identity, their need to be proud with their blackness, their need to uphold their sense of identity as a society and to be proud of themselves. So because of those ideas, they were now able to challenge apartheid effectively, leading also to the Soweto uprising. Then you can also look at other aspects like the Freedom Radio, which was broadcast from Tanzania. People in South Africa were able to access the ideas of the ANC through the Freedom Radio, which was a shortwave broadcast radio from Tanzania. The ANC was influencing people to challenge apartheid, though it was banned. So people adopting those ideas that were spread by the ANC, they were also able to get into a position of actively challenging against apartheid, leading to the Soweto uprising. Then you can also talk of aspects of the Bantu education. The Bantu education encompassed of a number of problems that the students were not happy with. For example, unqualified teachers in schools. Teachers were unqualified for the Black township schools, and also underfunding of the school. The schools were underfunded. The government preferred to fund white schools while it's disadvantaging the Black schools. There was overcrowding in the classrooms. So they had to challenge those apartheid malpractices. And also, if you can also check the ideas of Bantu education, there was also the issue of the curriculum itself. They were only doing subjects to train for low-paying jobs. So they were not happy. They were training the African child to be capable of doing low-paying jobs and to work for the white man. So because of those things, it fueled the tension. And also it made the Black people, the Black child rather, stand up against injustices of apartheid and fostered the rise against apartheid in the form of the Soweto uprising. So you must follow that. You must have a topic sentence addressing the question, then you have your points, and then you conclude your point to your paragraph to get those 8 marks. Right. So with that being said and done, that brings us to the end of this session or this discussion. We have covered parts of aspects of history, which is going to assist you in the end of year examinations. Most preferably, you have to check on those aspects of term 3 and also check on aspects of term 4. Basically, we are looking at the turning points in South African history, 1960, 1976, and 1990. 1960, 1976, and 1990. Like we look at the events of 1960, we are looking at events that happened like the Langa March. You look at events like the Sharpeville Massacre. You look at also events like the Women's March. Those were typical turning points events. Then you go to 1976, The prominent one is the Soweto Uprising. Then we go to 1990, where we look at the unbanning of political parties and the release of Nelson Mandela, leading to the negotiated settlement and apparently the formation of a democratic South Africa after elections in 1994. And also, don't forget, you are supposed to focus on apartheid laws, be able to understand the apartheid laws from term 3, know your apartheid laws and how they impacted on the lives of people. Know the precepts or the basic underlying principles of the laws and apparently how they negatively impacted on the lives of Black South Africans. Right, I think that is going to assist you as you prepare for your final examinations. Right, with that being said and done, that takes us to the end of this discussion. Your host, till we meet again in other discussions to follow. You have a good time studying.